Red Riding Hood. Good girls don't talk to werewolves. Red Riding Hood. Once upon a time, there was a girl and there was a wolf. Part 1. The blacksmith would marry her, the woodcutter would run away with her, the werewolf would turn her into one of its own. From the towering heights of the tree, the little girl could see everything. The sleepy village of Daggerhorn lay low in the bowl of the valley. From above, it looked like a faraway foreign land, a place she knew nothing about, a place without spikes or barbs, a place where fear did not hover like an anxious parent. Being this far up in the air made Valerie feel as if she could be someone else too. She could be an animal, a hawk, chilly with self-survival, arrogance, and apart. Even at age 7, she knew that somehow she was different from the other villagers. She couldn't help keeping them at a distance, even her friends who were open and wonderful. Her older sister Lucy was the one person in the world to whom Valerie felt connected. She and Lucy were like two vines that grew twisted together in the old song of the elders the village sang. Lucy was the only one. Valerie peered past her dangling bare feet and thought about why she had climbed up here. She wasn't allowed to, of course, but that wasn't it. And it wasn't for the challenge of the limb either. She had lost its thrill a year earlier, when she first reached the tallest branch and found nowhere left to go but open sky. She climbed up high because she couldn't breathe down there in the town. If she didn't get out, the unhappiness would settle upon her, piling up like snow until she was buried beneath it. Up here in her tree, the air was cool on her face and she felt invincible. She never worried about falling. Such a thing was not possible in this weightless universe. Valerie! Suzette's voice sounded upward through the leaves, calling for her like a hand tugging. Valerie backed down to earth. By the tone of her mother's voice, Valerie knew it was time to go. Valerie pulled her knees up to under her nose, rose to a crouch, and began her descent. Looking straight down, she could see the steeply pitched roof of Grandmother's house, built right into the branches of the tree and covered in a thick shag of pine needles. The house was wedged in a flowering of branches as if it had lodged in there during a storm. Valerie had always wondered how it had gotten there, but she never asked because something so wonderful should never be explained. It was nearing winter, and the leaves had begun to loosen up themselves from the branches, easing their autumn grasp. She shuddered and fell free as Valerie moved down the tree. She had perched in the tree all afternoon, listening to the low murmur of women's voices wafting up from below. It seemed like they were more cautious today, huskier than usual, as though the women were keeping secrets. Nearing the lower branches that grazed the treehouse of the roof, Valerie saw Grandmother float out onto the porch, her feet not visible beneath her dress. Grandmother was the most beautiful woman that Valerie knew. She wore long, layered skirts that swayed as she walked. If her right foot went forward, her silk skirt breezed to the left. Her ankles were delicate and lovely, the tiny wooden dancers in Lucy's jewelry box. This both delighted and frightened Valerie because they looked like they could snap. Valerie herself, unsnappable, leapt off the lowest branch and onto the porch with a solid thump. She was not excitable like the other girls whose cheeks were pink or round. Valerie's were smooth and even and pale white. Valerie didn't think of herself as pretty, or think about what she looked like for that matter. No one else, though, could forget the corn-husk blonde with the unsettling green eyes that lit up like they were charged by lightning. Her eyes, that knowing look she had, made her seem older than she was. "Girls, come on," her mother called from inside the house, anxiety bristling through her voice. "We need to be back early tonight." Valerie made it down before anyone else could see that she had been in the tree at all. Through the open door, Valerie saw Lucy bustle over to their mother, clutching the doll that she had dressed in scraps that Grandmother had donated to the cause. Valerie wished she could be more like her sister. Lucy's hands were soft and round, a bit pillowy, something Valerie admired. Her own hands were knobbly and thin, tough with calluses. Her body was all ankles. She felt deep inside this made her unlovable, someone no one would want to touch. Her older sister was better than she was. That much Valerie knew. Lucy was kinder, more generous, more patient. She never would have climbed above the treehouse where she knew sensible people didn't belong. "Girls, it's a full moon tonight," her mother's voice carried out to her now. "And it's our turn," she added sadly, her voice trailing off. Valerie didn't know what to make of it being their turn. She'd hoped that it was a surprise, maybe a present. Looking down to the ground, she saw some markings in the dirt that formed the shape of an arrow. Peter. Her eyes widened. She headed down the steep, dusky stairs from the treehouse to examine the marks. No, it isn't Peter, she thought, seeing they were just random scratches in the soil. But what if? The marks stretched away from her into the woods, instinctively ignoring what she should do. What Lucy would do, she followed them. Of course, they led nowhere. Within a dozen spaces, the marks disappeared. Mad at herself for wishful thinking, she was glad no one had seen her following nothing to nothing. Before he'd left, Peter used to leave messages for her by drawing arrows in the dirt with the tip of a stick. The arrows guided her to him, often hiding deep in the woods. He had been gone for months now, her friend. They had been inseparable, and Valerie still couldn't accept the fact that he wasn't coming back. His leaving had been like snipping off the end of a rope, two unraveling strands. Peter hadn't been like other boys who teased and fought. He understood Valerie's impulses. He understood adventure. He understood not following the rules. He judged her for being a girl. He never judged her for being a girl. "Valerie," Grandmother's voice now called. Her calls were to be answered more urgently than Valerie's mother, because her threats might actually be carried out. Valerie turned from the puzzle pieces that led to no prize and hurried back. "Down here, Grandmother." She leaned against the base of the tree. How many more pages do we have? Delighting in the feel of the sandpaper's bark, she closed her eyes to feel it fully and heard the grumbling of wagon wheels like an approaching thunderstorm. Hearing it too, Grandmother slipped down the stairs to the forest floor. She wrapped Valerie in her arms, the cool silk of her blouse and the chunky clumble of amulets pressing against Valerie's face. Her chin was on Grandmother's shoulder. Valerie saw Lucy moving cautiously down the tall stairs, followed by their mother. "Be strong tonight, my darlings," Grandmother whispered. Held tightly, Valerie stayed quiet, unable to voice her confusion. For Valerie, each person and place had its own scent. Sometimes the whole world seemed like a garden. She decided that her grandmother's smell, like crushed leaves, mingled with something deeper, something profound that she could not place. As soon as Grandmother released Valerie, Lucy handed her sister a bouquet of herbs and flowers she'd gathered from the woods. The wagon, pulled by two muscular workhorses, came bumping over the ruts in the road. The woodcutters were seated in clusters atop the freshly chopped tree stumps that slid forward in the wagon, lurched to a stop in the front of the grandmother's tree. Besides, the fattest ones at the bottom and the lightest ones at the top, branches, were piled between the men. To Valerie, the riders looked like they were made of wood themselves. Valerie saw her father, César, seated at the back of the cart. He stood and reached down for Lucy. He knew no better than to try for Valerie. He reeked of sweat and ale and swayed far from him. She stayed far from him. "I love you, Grandmother," Lucy called out over her shoulder as she let César help her and her mother over the side of the cart. Valerie scrambled up and in on her own. With the snap of the reins, the wagon lumbered to a start. The woodcutter shifted aside to give Suzette and the girls room, with César reached over, landing a theatrical kiss on the man's cheek. "César," Susan suddenly hissed, casting him a quiet, reproachful glance as side conversations picked up in the wagon. "I'm surprised you're still conscious at this late hour." Valerie had heard accusations like this before, always veiled behind false overtone of cleverness or wit. And yet, it is still jolted her to hear them say that with such a tone of contempt. She looked at her sister, who hadn't heard their mother because she was laughing at something another woodcutter had said. Lucy always insisted that her parents were in love, that love was not about grand gestures, but rather about the day-to-day, about being there, going to work and coming home in the evening. Valerie had tried to believe that this was true, but she couldn't help feeling that there had to be something more to love, something less practical. She now hung on tight, and she leaned over the back rails of the wagon, peering down at the rapidly disappearing ground, feeling dizzy. She turned to face back in. "My baby," Suzette pulled Valerie onto her lap, and Valerie let her. Her pale, pretty mother smelled like almonds and powdery flour. As the wagon emerged from the Black Raven Woods and rumbled alongside the Sliver River, the dreary haze of the villages came into full view. Its foreboding was palpable at a distance. Slits, stilts, spikes, and barbs jutted up and out. The granary's looking tower, the tallest town's point, stretched high. It was the first thing anyone felt while coming over the bridge. Fear. Daggerhorn was a town full of people who were afraid, people who felt unsafe even in their beds and vulnerable with each step, exposed to every turn. The people had begun to believe that they deserved the torture, that they had done something wrong and that something inside them was bad. Valerie had watched the villagers cowering in fear every day and felt her distance from them. What she feared more than the outside was a darkness that came from the inside of her. It seemed as if she only one felt that way. Other than that, Peter, that is. She thought back to when he'd been there, the two of them fearless together with reckless joy. Now she resented the villagers for their fear, for the loss of her friend. Once through the massive wooden gates, the town looked like any other in the kingdom. The horses kicked up pockets of dust as they did in all such towns, and every face was familiar. The stray dog roamed the streets, their bellies empty and drooping, sucked in impossibly tight at the sides, so their fur looked striped. The ladders rested gently against the porches. Most spilled out from the crevices in the roofs and crawled across the front of the houses, and no one did anything about it. Tonight the villagers were hurrying to bring in their animals inside. It was the wolf's night, just as it had been every full moon for as long as anyone could remember. Sheeps were herded and locked behind heavy doors, handed off from one family member to another. Chickens strained their necks as if they were thrust up ladders, stretching them out so far that Valerie worried they would rip themselves clean of their own bodies.